Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning everyone.
Good morning, Father.
And today is May 31st, 2014. Okay, so today we will be taking in the Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 115. This is called the Bahudhātuka Sutta, which means the discourse on the many elements. And the Buddha approaches this topic a little bit indirectly, since he begins first he addresses the monks, and then he starts the discourse by drawing a contrast between two types of people. One is called the fool. In Pali, this word is bāla, which also means a child, an infant. And it's contrasted with the wise person, which is called pandita. You know, now from this Indian word, it's sort of been absorbed into English. We have the word pundit, which is now used almost in a somewhat derogatory sense, like somebody who thinks he's an expert, usually an expert on national or international affairs. But originally, the word was used in a positive sense, we call it commendative, a commending sense, as a person who is learned and wise. And even in India today, one finds people who are called pundits, pandit. Sometimes they call them panditji, and they're referring to them directly. And these would be like especially learned Brahmins who have mastered the Vedas and the other sacred texts of Hinduism. And so the Buddha begins this discourse by drawing this contrast between the foolish person, the bāla, and the wise, the learned, intelligent person, the pandita. So he says, whatever fears arise, fear, I think we should take this more in the objective sense than the subjective sense. Whatever dangers arise, all arise because of the fool, not because of the wise man. Whatever troubles arise, all arise because of the fool, not because of the wise man. Whatever calamities arise, all arise because of the fool, not because of the wise man. And then he uses a simile to illustrate the danger of the fool, the dangers that the fool creates. This is like a fire that starts in a shed or a hut made of grasses or reeds. And so once that fire starts, it starts spreading and it burns down all the other types of buildings. Even houses with peaked roofs plastered inside and out, secured by bars with shuttered windows. And so whatever dangers arise, all arise because of the fool. Okay, and so the fool brings danger, the fool brings trouble, the fool brings calamity, while the wise person doesn't bring any kind of danger, trouble, or calamity. Okay, so then, from that introduction, the Buddha then says that you should, he's addressing the monks, he says, you should train thus, we shall be wise men, we shall be inquirers, those who make inquiry or investigation. Okay, so then when the Buddha says this, then Ananda brings up the question, how a monk can be called a wise man, how he can be called an inquirer, one who investigates things. And then the Buddha introduces the subject, the main subject of the discourse. He says that for a monk to be a wise man, an inquirer, he should be skilled in the elements, skilled in the bases, skilled in dependent origination, and skilled in what is possible and what is impossible. That is, we call this the Matika. This is the almost the table of contents, the outline, the sort of list of subjects. And then the rest of the discourse, the Buddha is going to explain and elaborate these particular topics. It's a little bit puzzling to me that in this list of topics, the Buddha doesn't mention here the 5 aggregates, because one would think that one who's investigating things would also investigate them in terms of the 5 aggregates. And in so many other suttas, the Buddha enumerates and explains the 5 aggregates. I don't know why they're not mentioned here, but it's just possible, conceivable, that in other versions of the sutta, which has come down in different lines of transmission, the 5 aggregates were also mentioned. And maybe somehow they dropped out from the Pali transmission. In any case, we start off with the section on how a monk can be called skilled in the elements. And here the Buddha begins directly with the most common way of classifying things according to the elements. And this is by way of the 18 elements. So the 18 elements, we can arrange these in a very convenient, neat table. Let's see which one it starts with. Okay, so we have, if we look at the 18 elements, we could see that we can arrange them according to 6 sense faculties, 6, what seem to be 6 types of sense objects, and 6 types of consciousness. And now, when we see an arrangement like this, we might raise the question, why does the Buddha put so much emphasis on analyzing things into their elements? What would be the purpose of this? Any thoughts? Did I see a little palm?
My guess is that we want you to see the non-existence of ego.
To see?
Non-existence of ego.
Okay, that's basically along the right track. Because normally we sort of grasp upon the perception of, the constituents of our being. We grasp upon them as being some kind of compact or solid whole. In the technical language of Buddhism, we call this sometimes pinda gaha. Grasping upon a mass, an accumulation, a pile of phenomena, and taking them to be some kind of solid entity, solid, substantial entity. And based upon this grasping of the whole, there arises the idea of the self, the ego, some kind of truly existing I, the basis for the thought, the notion, I am. And then when we grasp the I, the ego, then there comes an identification of the ego with body, feelings, perceptions, and so forth. And so then we become attached to the sense of I, and from the sense of I comes the sense of mine, what belongs to me. And for the Buddha, this is the sort of manifestation or solidification of ignorance, sort of the way our world becomes constellated into a field in which the center is the ego, the I, the self, and everything is seen to depend upon the self and to revolve around the self. So the self then becomes the center of experience, the center of the universe. And so what the Buddha does is to put a kind of microscope onto this pinda, this lump, this mass, this collection that we identify as being I or myself, and inquire what is actually there. And when we look into that mass, that assemblage, one finds that it's actually a combination of components, sometimes analyzed into the 5 aggregates. But here, the emphasis, the analysis is in terms of the 18 elements. And so I would say that if we compare the 5 aggregates with the 18 elements, what kind of difference do we see? How would we maybe explain the difference between them? I assume everybody knows what the 5 aggregates are? I say everybody is nodding like this. Sometimes one has to check up because Heads might nod like this out of habit. Can anybody enumerate the 5 aggregates in the correct sequence?
Form, feeling, perception, mental formation, concept.
Okay, very good. Excellent. Okay, so we have form, material form, feeling, perception, the mental formations, sometimes called volitional formations, and consciousness. Okay, now compare with the 18 elements, 6 sense faculties or sense organs, 6 sense objects, 6 types of consciousness. And what kind of difference do we see?
It occurred to me that this is in a way an answer to why doesn't he talk the 5 aggregates.
Yeah.
That I saw it as a microscope that's looking even closer.
Okay, that's a good point.
You see the tinier pieces.
Okay, that's a
You can
good
talk
point.
about 5, or you can really
Yeah, that's a good point.
the 18.
Yeah, so she says that she sees the 18 elements as being a kind of finer analysis of the factors that are brought in under the 5 aggregates. Any other ideas? And when I ask this question, I don't have in my mind the idea there's a right answer, and I'm testing whether to see whether you get the right answer. But just express your own sort of understanding of what the difference might be. What is your name, by the way?
Oh, Hector.
Hector. Okay.
The difference that I see is that this lists the sense object. Within the aggregates, I don't see the sense object. It's there.
Yeah. And so we have sense objects, and not only sense objects, but what else do we have not mentioned specifically in the 5 aggregates?
I think it's feelings.
Excuse me?
Feelings.
We have this. Oh, I see feelings mentioned in the aggregates. Yeah, but let's take it from this standpoint. What do we see in the 18 elements? Since Hector said he sees the sense objects mentioned, what do we see in the elements that we don't see mentioned specifically in the aggregates? Right, the sense faculties. And we know that 5 of the sense faculties are material phenomena. The eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, and the body sense. And of the sense objects, we have visible form, sound, odors, tastes, and tactile objects. And those also come under the aggregate of form. So we could say that here we have at least 10 factors, 10 elements belong to the aggregate of form. Okay, another difference between the scheme of the 18 elements and the scheme of the 5 aggregates. Taking it from the angle of the elements looking to the aggregates. The answer, it's already on the board. Maybe my question isn't phrased precisely.
Consciousness.
So how do you express the difference? You got it right, but let's get a more precise statement.
Awareness of the senses.
Okay, when we have the aggregates, we state just the consciousness aggregate. Just one, right? But here we have 6 types of consciousness, right? So we could say that there's a finer analysis of consciousness. So consciousness aggregate then becomes at least 6 elements, maybe 7. Okay, now looking from the aggregates to the elements, what do we find in the aggregates that we don't find mentioned specifically in the elements? Kuan, this is just a simple, like a logical question, using logical sets.
I think it is perceptions and feelings,
And,
not to mention.
yeah, we have 3 aggregates: feeling aggregate, perception aggregate, mental formations or volition aggregate, which are not specifically mentioned under the 18 elements. But the 18 elements are supposed to comprehend everything. So that means that those 3 aggregates have to fit someplace within the 18 elements. Where would they fit? This is a little tricky question.
The mental faculty.
The what?
The mental faculty.
The mind faculty.
Yeah, the mind faculty.
No.
In mind consciousness?
No. Yeah, this is a hard one to get. But this is the way sort of the Abhidhammikas, the masters of or the teachers of the Abhidhamma, the formulators of the Abhidhamma did it. It seems, when you look at this, it seems that mental phenomena, which is in Pali, Dhamma Dhatu, when you see the parallel columns, it seems that mental phenomena should be the objects of mind consciousness. Just like forms are the object of eye consciousness, sounds are the object of ear consciousness, odors are the object of nose consciousness, and so on. So it would seem sort of logical to infer that the Dhamma Dhatu, the mental phenomena, are simply the objects of mind consciousness, which is called Mano Vijnana Dhatu, the mind consciousness element. But this left the problem, if that were the case, it would leave the problem, where does feeling, perception, and the volitional mental activities fit in? They're not actual mind element, they're not actual mind consciousness element, because those are factors associated with the mind, not mind itself. So the Abhidhamma teaches put feeling, perception, and mental formations under the heading of Dhammādhātu, the mental phenomena. So the mental phenomena doesn't mean only the objects of mind consciousness, but it's both objects of mind consciousness and the factors that arise associated with consciousness. That is feeling, perception, and mental formations. I know it's a little confusing, but when I was starting to study Chinese with a woman named Sharon Chi, sometimes when I would come across some phrase in Chinese, I didn't understand how this was to be understood syntactically, or the exact sense of the idiom. She would just say, "Oh, that's the way they say it in Chinese." So if you're puzzled by this, I just have to say, that's the way the teachers of the Abhidhamma classified it. Okay, now something a little sort of puzzling is, what is the relationship here? Mind and mind consciousness. And what is meant by mind and what is meant by mind consciousness? Okay, if we take let's take the parallel case with the eye. Okay, we know what the eye is, and we know what eye consciousness is, that there's a kind of consciousness that arises based on the eye, especially the inner parts of the eye, which have the functions of receiving light and sort of transforming light into signals. In modern physiology, maybe the rods and cones which take the light, change them into colors, or at least the physical components of colors, counterparts of colors, transmit it through the ocular nerve to certain regions of the brain where it becomes perceived as colors. Okay, so we know what the eye is, or let's say the whole visual apparatus. We know what colors are, and we know that eye consciousness is a type of consciousness that arises based on the visual apparatus and that sees colors, sees forms, colors, and shapes. So what is mind here? One might think, well, the mind must be the physical basis of consciousness, but that's not the way the teachers of the exponents of the Dhamma explain it. And in the suttas themselves, one doesn't find an explicit definition of mind and mind consciousness and the drawing of a relationship between them, which is a bit puzzling. It's all puzzled me for decades. Why one never sees like a monk come to the Buddha and say, "Bhante, you're always talking about mano, mind, and mano vijnana, mind consciousness. What are they? What is the relationship between them?" But one never sees that question brought up. It's always just, "Yes, Bhante." "Ama Bhante, Ama Bhante." "Evang Bhante, Evang Bhante." But then it seems that this question got decided or really treated analytically only when we come to the age of the Abhidhamma, where in the Pali Abhidhamma system, the mind element becomes identified with I don't want to drive you out halfway through the class, but becomes identified with three particular occasions of mental activity within the process of cognition. One of these phases is what is called the 5-door adverting consciousness. This is the consciousness that arises, the momentary citta, or active consciousness that arises when an object impinges on one of the sense faculties. So a visible form sort of strikes against the eye, or a sound impinges on the ear. Now before, in the case of the visible form, before the eye consciousness arises, seeing the form, there arises just one moment of mind in which the mind sort of is swinging like back and forth. There's a very vague recognition that something is impinging on a sense faculty. Which sense faculty is it? And it's sort of swinging among the sense faculties until it fixes on the form. So this is called the 5-door adverting consciousness, because the 5 doors are the 5 sense doors: eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and body. And then when an object impinges, this consciousness sort of arises and says, which door is being knocked on? And then if it recognizes it's a form knocking on the eye door, then eye consciousness will arise. But if it's a sound impinging on the ear, then ear consciousness will arise. This is a little bit like, suppose you have a house with 5 doors. The door to the north, east, south, west. And where else can we have a door? The attic, but people won't approach a building unless you're admitting vampires that fly through the sky. Somebody said another idea? Oh yeah, maybe somebody has an entrance through the garage. Okay, so you're sitting in your living room or your study in the middle of the house, then there comes a knocking on the door. And so you pick up your head from what you're doing and you wonder what door is being knocked on. And you listen again, and then the person will knock. Then you recognize, it's the front door, it's the back door, one of the side doors. Then you go to the door and you answer it. And so that is called the 5-door adverting consciousness. Then immediately after the 5-door adverting consciousness, there will arise the sense consciousness. That will be either the eye consciousness, seeing the form, the ear consciousness, hearing the sound, and so on. And then immediately after the sense consciousness, there arises one type of consciousness that, it said, receives the object. Its simple function is just to accept the object, sort of to take it in. I don't know how to explain this more simply. But maybe if we use an analogy, analogies are always imperfect, but it's like you're playing ball with somebody, and then somebody throws you the ball, then you catch it, maybe catching the ball, the moment the ball comes into the grip of your hands, that is like the sense consciousness. And then the next moment, you just fasten your grip on the ball, and that is like the receiving consciousness, which just receives the object.
Would that be like going from seeing to looking or hearing?
Not quite. The looking would come at a still later stage. It's a good question. But this is, we have to understand that these are like very rapid moments of consciousness, just, fleeting by, they say, hundreds of times in the snap of a finger. So it just has this very simple function of receiving the object. And then there'll come receiving. Then there comes a consciousness called investigating. Maybe the investigating consciousness would be like the initial moment of looking. And then there comes something called the determining consciousness, where one determines the nature of the object that one has received or accepted. And so the Abhidhamma teachers then identify the mind element with the 5-door inverting and the receiving. But that is the Abhidhamma way of explanation. In the suttas, as I said, it's not analyzed or not made explicit. So my assumption would be probably at the level of the sutta discourse, the mind element is conceived just as some kind of faculty responsible for, let us say, for directing the attention to the object, on the basis of which mind consciousness will then arise clearly and determinately perceiving or cognizing the object. Okay, I'll repeat that again. This is sort of my interpretation, would be that at the level of sutta explanation, the mind element would be simply a faculty or a mental function that directs the attention to the object coming in, and that serves as the basis for mind consciousness to arise and clearly determine the nature of the object that's been perceived or cognized. Clearly and distinctly, yeah, that's the Cartesian terms. Richard?
Yes, so then...
Do we have the floating mic, do we have the mobile microphone here?
Trying to better.
Okay, anyway, you could speak loudly.
So that seems to imply that all of the objects and all of, all of the functions are really concerned solely with the senses, as that the only thing being cognized
Yeah.
are senses. In that case, I was expecting mind consciousness
Yeah.
to be something about introspection, about consciousness of one's own thoughts.
Okay, yeah.
Where does that fit?
Actually, that's a good point. And all of that kind of activity, reflective activity, introspective activity, emotional reactions to the objects perceived, planning, launching projects in the world and so forth, all of that would take place within the domain of mind consciousness.
So it's included.
Yeah, it's very inclusive, mind consciousness. It's its task is not only to determine the nature of objects that are impinging on the field of awareness. That is sort of like the elementary level of cognition, but then built upon that within the realm of mind consciousness, all the more sophisticated mental functions will take place.
Okay, under sense faculty comes Chakku Vijnana, so eye consciousness.
No,
Eye faculty, right?
yeah, under the sense faculty comes only eye, ear, nose, tongue, body. Excuse me?
The sixth one would be the mind.
The sixth one is mind, or what's in terms of elements, it's Dhamma, Mano Dhatu. I'm sorry, I should have put that. This one is Mano Dhatu. Which is mind element. And then that is contrasted with mind consciousness element, which is Mano Vijnana Dhatu. Yeah, so we have to be careful we have to be careful to recognize that the faculties, at least with the senses, are the physical sense faculties themselves, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body. And those are distinct from the consciousnesses that are...
Sixth one would be mana.
Yeah, the sixth faculty is the the sixth faculty is the Mano Dhatu, and its object is Dhamma Dhatu. Then based on these two, we have mind consciousness element, Mano Vijnana Dhatu.
So does that mean the eye faculty would be Chakku Dhatu?
Yeah. Chakku Dhatu, the ear would be Sota Dhatu. Form, visible form would be Rupa Dhatu. Sound would be Saddha Dhatu, and so on. Was there some other question on?
At what point will the mind determine if that object that's coming towards them
Yeah.
is dangerous or not?
Oh.
Is it the mind consciousness or the mind receiving?
No, that would be the work of a pretty advanced stage of mind consciousness. The way, this isn't dealt with in the suttas, it's not, we don't find like detailed analysis like this in the suttas, which have a more practical orientation. And even in the old layer of the Abhidhamma, we don't find analysis like that. But the later teachers of the Abhidhamma, particularly I think this could have developed in Burma, by the Abhidhamma teachers in Burma, even 18th, 19th century, have developed like very complex explanations of how the different stages of cognition unfold, one based on another. So even to recognize an object, for me to recognize this as a cup, for example, what has to take place? First, there's the visual perception. Then based on the visual perception, which would be a process occurring through the eye consciousness, then there would take place a mind consciousness by which I determine clearly the shape, color of this. Then there will be a number of layers or phases of cognition by which are occurring very, very quickly, so I'm not even aware of them, by which the mind compares this impression with that of similar impressions of things that have been used before as a cup, and then determines based on that, comes to a definite, clear, and distinct cognition, this is a cup. And then it's even more sophisticated, say, I look in this cup, I see like a pale yellow, and this one is a reddish brown. So when I look at these simultaneously, it's a pretty sophisticated operation. First to determine the difference in the colors, then to infer this is probably a Chinese oolong tea, whereas this can be either a Ceylon type of tea, or Indian type of tea, or a herbal tea. And then to wonder, what exactly is this? All of that's this sort of later stages of mind consciousness following upon the initial sense consciousness. And finally, curiosity overcomes me. It's a herbal tea, but I can't place the flavor, so